Welcome to my narrated step-by-step tutorial for my painting Acadia Coast. This painting is accomplished on an 8x10 inch sheet of 140 pound cold press Lanaquarel watercolor paper. The photograph on the right was the inspiration for this painting. However, I made a number of changes in order to come up with a composition that I found more pleasing. I opted not to include any of the people in this photograph in my painting. I also didn't like the shape of the peninsula in the distance, so I changed that to a shape that I preferred. I also wanted some distant trees in this painting, so I put in a line of light faded trees behind the trees that are in the foreground. I wanted to have more ocean in my composition, so I brought that in much farther than what it appears in the photograph. I also included a few seagulls in the sky just for interest and to provide a little bit of action to the composition. While I found inspiration in this photograph, by no means was I attempting to copy the image. I made several changes to the composition and also opted to paint with my own palette and color scheme. I'm going to begin by drawing a light sketch on my sheet of watercolor paper, and I'm using a B pencil. I'm going to make the composition changes that I mentioned a moment ago as I sketch this out. So here I'm drawing the distant peninsula, and I'm making adjustments to the shape. I didn't really care for the one in the photograph, so I made adjustments to that. One of the things I liked about the photograph is the direction in which the rocks are laying. It creates a nice angle as it kind of moves away from the pine trees. So that's one of the elements I want to capture of the rocks. However, I'm not making a detailed sketch of the rocks themselves. I'm just giving a suggestion of where some of the shadows may be and trying to follow that kind of feeling of a direction as I lay this out. And I'll come in with some very expressive brush marks in these areas, so I'm not trying to necessarily draw in detail shapes that I'm going to come in and try and paint within the lines with my paintbrush. I'm just trying to give the suggestion of the direction of those rocks with these marks that I'm making. I'm also trying to suggest the spatial relationships that exist between the rocks, the trees, the water, and the sky. Here I want to capture a little bit of some of that rock extending out into the water a little bit off the shoreline, and I'm going to put the indication of a few smaller rocks that are sticking out of the water there in a few spots. I'm going to indicate where the tree line is going to be, and I'm just going to do that by making some vertical marks to give the indication of where I'm going to potentially put some trees. So I'm not drawing individual trees, I'm just giving the vertical, the suggestion of the vertical shape that's going to be there when I come in and paint the trees. So I'm not trying to render a tree as I do my sketch, just an indication of where the verticality of those trees is going to be. So my drawing is pretty much complete. I've made the changes to the composition that I wanted to make. And now I'm going to give the indication of some gulls flying in the air. It just helps bring a little bit of life to the painting, to the composition. And they're not going to be detailed by any means. When I do something like this, I try to keep it to an odd number. So in this case, I'm putting 3 gulls in the sky. I try to make sure the shapes aren't the same. And I position them so that they're flying in a direction that helps bring the viewer into the painting. Here I'm making the last gull shape in the sky. Now I'm going to zoom in so you can get a little bit of a closer look at the sketch. You can see by no means is this a detailed rendering of my subject. I want to save the gull shapes as a white shape, so I'm going to take a fine line masking fluid pen and mask those gull shapes before I begin putting a sky wash on my painting. The fine line masking fluid pen is a good tool for applying small amounts of masking fluid, such as with these gulls. You just have to make sure that you put the cap in as soon as you're done, or it'll clog up on you. I'm going to let the masking fluid dry completely before I begin to paint. I'm going to begin my painting by starting with a sky wash. That's a mixture of cerulean blue and manganese blue. And as I apply this, I'm trying to capture the direction in the sky. I like the direction of both the sky and the rocks as they kind of angle away from the tree line. And this is somewhat of a middle value. Still has quite a bit of water in it though. And I'm going to come in with the fine mist spray bottle and soften the edges. I don't want any hard edges. I just want this more cloud-like feeling. So I'm going to use this very fine mist spray bottle to do that. At the same time, I'm going to try and keep some of that the directional feeling that I saw in the photograph. I need to make sure that I blot that water up when I use a spray bottle like this, so it doesn't give me any undesirable results. I'm going to come back in with a little bit of blue here. Now my paper's saturated, so as I come back in, it's wet and wet. And because it's saturated, it's just going to blend with the paint that's there. It's not going to give me a backwash or a blossom at all. Here again, you can see that I'm blotting up that excess water. And I've lifted it off the area that's the rock. I'm not too worried about where the trees are because I'm going to be going over that with a much darker value. Now that I have that applied and I've blotted up the excess water, I'm going to come in with my hairdryer and dry that thoroughly. So now I have my sky in there, and I'm probably not going to do too much more to the sky. I like how it is, and I'm probably going to leave it pretty much as it is. I'm going to start painting this distant peninsula, and to do that I'm using a mixture of mauve and royal blue. And then I'm going to come in and just touch a little bit along the top with a mixture of sap green and pyro red. So I mixed a little pyro red in my green to neutralize it a little bit, and then I've come in and again, because my paint is saturated where I applied that kind of a violet tone, that green is just going to diffuse right into that wash without causing a backwash because I'm painting wet and wet at that point. And now I'm going to blot that, and again I'm going to dry this. You'll notice that I frequently stop and dry my work with a hair dryer as I like to build my layers, and I want them to be clean layers. And now this is my distant line of trees that I wanted to have in here, and this wasn't in the photograph, but I wanted a distant line of trees, and I'm going to kind of suggest that this is distant here using a little bit of the mixture of the mauve and the royal blue that's been diluted quite a bit, and just giving the suggestion of some distant trees here. Here I'm continuing that line over, and they're not going to go over all the way. I'm going to come in with some different darker trees in the foreground. So I'm going to drop this off here. I'm going to soften that with a spray bottle and just let the edge diffuse away a little bit. I'm going to blot it. And then once again, I'm going to come in and I'm going to dry this. I've dried that grouping of trees that I just put in, and now I'm going to go back to that distant peninsula and give more of a suggestion that there's some trees on that peninsula. It's not going to be, it's a straight line is how I had it, but it's going to have trees on it, and there'll be some irregularities in that line. So I'm going to go back and put some of that indication of that on the top edge of the peninsula shape. Just giving the indication there that there's some trees out on that peninsula. I've changed to a 1/2 inch flat brush. This is a silver black velvet 1/2 inch flat. And I've got a mixture of this royal blue with mauve in it. And it just gives me a middle value purple tone. And I'm just taking that flat brush and following the kind of the directional lines that I've indicated in my sketch, and just giving the suggestion of shadowed areas of rocks. So I'm not rendering anything. I'm just trying to make some expressive brush marks that help give the suggestion of direction and contour some of the surface by the direction of the brush marks. And that I'm going to build on this as I work through this painting. But right now it's just very little in terms of detail. I'm just making shapes and making some expressive brush marks, but I'm trying to capture the direction of those rocks and leave some of those spatial relationships, because that's a big open flat surface there on top of those rocks, the way they lay there on the Acadia coast. Carrying that tone back here to the edge, you can feel it kind of coming into the composition, and it's a little darker value that I've applied there. But I'm going to take the spray bottle and I'm going to just lightly soften a few edges and let some of that color diffuse a little bit, but not too much, just a little bit. I'm going to make a few more brush marks here, a few there to indicate some rocks out in the water, and then just a little small peninsula jetting out there. And that's a good start there. I've switched to a quill brush that I like to use. It's got a fine point, but it holds a lot of paint. I like to use these sometimes to paint these kind of trees. And I've loaded up my brush with a mixture of sap green with pyro red to neutralize it a little bit. And I've put in a little bit of royal blue to make it a darker tone. And as I paint these in, I'm going to come in a few spots with a little bit of burnt sienna in the mixture, just to warm it up and give some variation in that color. And you can see as I paint these trees, while they're individual trees, I'm painting them as one big shape. You can see they just run together, the same value, the same tone. And so while there's the characteristics of the individual trees, in the end it's all coming together as one big shape. Now I'm going to continue with this brushwork here. I'm going to take this this grouping of trees that forms this shape all the way to the edge of the page of the paper. I've got that shape in all the way. I'm going to do a little bit of brushwork along the bottom just to clean the edge up a little bit. The mixture of paint I was using wasn't fully saturated with water, so it wasn't a super wet mixture I was putting down. So my paper is damp right now and it has a sheen to it. And I want to scrape some shapes in there, giving the indication of tree trunks and some maybe rock shapes. And I can do that when my paper has a sheen. If it was so wet that it was glossy, I wouldn't be able to do that. It would leave a dark mark and wouldn't allow me to move the pigment around with this plastic scraper that I'm using. And you can use a plastic credit card or just a hard plastic edge of about anything. And you can see that I've scratched in a few kind of rock shapes, and a few areas already dried to a point where I can't move the paint anymore. Because as I do this, I'm not removing paper, I'm not scratching into the paper, I'm just moving the paint and revealing the white surface of the paper as I do that. Now that I've done some scraping, I'm going to come back in with my quill brush, and I've loaded it up with a much darker pigment. This is still a mixture of sap green, pyro red, and royal blue. It just has more royal blue in the mixture to make it a darker value. And now I'm giving just the indication of some trees that are even closer in the foreground than the line that I already painted. And I laid in some of these darker trees. I'm also going to take that same value and give kind of the indication of the area underneath and behind these trees. Give it a little bit of depth, create a little bit of a horizontal plane there to make it feel more like ground, and anchor these to the ground a little bit. But still using the same mixture. It's a darker value, and doing the brush work with my quill brush. I'm going to do a little bit more brush work on towards the base of these trees, and still using this dark value, but cleaning up the edge and again helping to anchor what's going on there, make it feel more like a horizontal plane in the background. Also making a few vertical marks to give a suggestion of a tree trunk or a shadow side of a tree trunk. And I'm going to take that same mixture, that same dark value mixture that I'm using there, and I'm going to take it down in this area that I previously painted with just the mauve. It carries that tone down, that mixture, and helps bring some harmony to the painting. And not just harmony, but helps balance the composition. If all those dark values were just on one side of the painting, it wouldn't feel right. So working that dark value into the rock area here helps keep this composition balanced. Keep in mind, this is my interpretation of this photograph. I have no intention to copy it. I'm taking out the parts that I feel inspire me, but it's my interpretation of the scene, and I've made a number of compositional adjustments as I talked about earlier in this video. So the brush marks I'm making right now are more a response to composition and design than they are the photograph. I've switched back over to my 1/2" flat brush, and I've loaded it up with a mixture of quinacridone gold and raw sienna. And I'm going to use this to give more of an indication of the rocks. And as I do that, this kind of gold sienna tone is going to start to become more dominant in my composition. You'll see that more as I paint this large expanse of rocks with this gold tone. And as I make my brush marks, I try to keep that feeling of direction and make those kind of in the same direction that I did with the shadowed areas that I painted with the violet tone. So I'm trying to play up this feeling of direction of the rocks, just as I did with the sky, and how they go away from the tree line. You can see here I'm taking the fine mist spray and I'm softening this wash. But as I do that, I still try and carry some of the feeling of direction with my spray. And I continue to blot that up after I spray so I don't get any undesirable backwash. So now the brush marks I'm making are wet and wet because after spraying that paper, it's saturated with water until I dry it, which I'm going to do now. I'm going to continue working with my 1/2" flat brush, and I've loaded it up with a mixture of royal blue and sap green. It gives me kind of a nice blue-green color that I like to work with. It kind of has the feeling of the sea. And as I do this, I'm using a variety of edges on my brush. The strokes that I just made or making are made with a tip, and I drag it along, and then I tilt it down and capture more of the side against the texture of the paper to give that more of a rough effect that to give the suggestion of the reflection of light on the sea. As I start to get closer to the coastline here, to the edge of the rocks, I've added a little more blue to my mixture. And you can see the subtle transition from close to moving out, how it gets a little bit more of a blue-green going away from the shoreline. It has a little bit more of a blue content as it gets closer. And I've painted that a fairly dark value. It's not dark, but it's a dark middle value. As I've applied this, I've used the tip of my brush, the side of my brush, and then I've just used it kind of upright to apply more of an even tone over a larger area. And at times I'm using the corner of my brush also. So now I have kind of a flat wash and also a textural quality in some areas, so different techniques in applying the paint. And now I'm taking my fine mist spray to soften that edge a little bit, and actually that wash, soften it up and just give the feeling of maybe a little slight sea spray as it hits the rocks. Continuing to work with this 1/2" flat brush, and now I'm using a bit of a darker warm tone. Most of the darker values to this point were the kind of a violet tone. So now I've taken my quinacridone gold and added some quinacridone coral, and I've actually put a little burnt sienna in it, and even just a touch of royal blue, so it's not quite as bright, but it's created a middle value warm tone. And I'm just making some darker value marks to complement the cool marks that I made earlier in the painting process. And you can see here as I make these, once again I'm using a variety of edges from my flat brush. I use the corner to make some small little marks, and I use the tip, and I'm not dragging it flat along the edge so much to give it a rough texture, but I am using the brush at a number of angles to make some of the marks that I'm making. And as I do this, once again, I'm keeping in mind the spirit of the direction of those rocks and trying to play up on the direction of rocks. And putting a little bit of that warm tone out there on those rocks in the water so they feel more like rocks and not just dark shapes. Here, I'm taking a little bit of this color and starting to use the edge of the brush to just give the suggestion of some grassy shapes. Now I'm going to come in a little bit with some of the darker tones that I used earlier. A little bit of that royal blue and mauve, and even a little bit of green here and there. And I'm going to just make some dark marks, and then I'm going to drag that paint a little bit with my plastic scraper. So I'm not trying to scrape a light linear mark into this. What I'm doing is trying to just take that paint that I just put in with my brush, as I'm doing here. I'm just making a wet mark with my paint, and then I'm using my scraper to drag that up and make a grassy shape. I want that gold tone on those rocks to be stronger, so I'm coming back in with my 1/2" flat brush, and I'm using a mixture of quinacridone gold with raw sienna again, but it's a little darker value than what I had earlier, and give a little bit more substance to these rocky shapes and the surface of these rocks. Still here and there I'm going to use my spray bottle to soften a few edges and let that color diffuse a little bit. Makes it feel like watercolor sometimes when that spray hits it and lets that color just kind of softly diffuse out. I like that quality, that softness that it gives. I'm going to take a small nylon flat brush. It's actually an angled brush with clear water in it, so it's a damp brush. It's not dripping with water, but it's a damp brush, and I'm going to do some lifting on these darker tree shapes there just to give the indication of some tree trunks and maybe even some grassy shapes. I'm also going to take this and damp brush and try and do just a little bit of lifting here in the area on the rocks where I give the indication of some grassy shapes coming up. So this isn't necessarily going to leave a light mark so much as drag some of the color up and give it's just a subtle suggestion of some of these grassy shapes, but just another tone. It's just a light tone. It's hard to pick up maybe with a camera. I've switched over to a small liner brush or a rigger brush, and I'm taking a dark value and just giving the indication of some of these kind of old trees, the old nags they call them. And I'll use a combination of a dark value that's leaning towards the blue side, and I'll mix in a little bit of burnt sienna to give me a warmer dark value and in a few of these areas too on some of these shapes that I'm making. I'm also going to take my liner brush and give the indication of a few more grassy shapes here on the rocks. So I'll take that same value. This one in particular is a warm dark value, and I'll just make some more grassy shapes here on these rocks. I've switched back to my quill brush, and I've got a very dark value here that's a lot of royal blue, a little mauve in it, and just a touch of burnt sienna to neutralize it a little bit. But I'm using this dark value to do some negative painting around some of these shapes that I already have in my composition and just strengthen the contrast. So you can see some of these areas where I've lifted out, I've come in and put a darker value on the side, again, to build depth and strengthen the contrast. I'm also doing some brush work here on some of these grassy shapes. Again, it helps build contrast and gives a little bit more depth. Just doing some negative painting here in between these grassy shapes. Now I'm going to take a rubber cement pickup eraser and remove that small amount of masking fluid that I had put on my paper to preserve the shapes of the gulls that I have in my painting. And I'm coming in now just to give the indication of kind of the shadowed areas of the birds using a mixture of burnt sienna and royal blue to give me a gray tone. So not overdoing it, but just trying to indicate the shadowed areas on these shapes and leave some of the white. And I'm going to just touch that a little bit with a Kleenex here to soften that value a little bit and lighten it up just a little. It's a little strong up there, so just touch it with a Kleenex. I'm going to put a white mat on this so you can get a good look at it. So that's my interpretation of the photograph and my painting Acadia Coast. I hope you enjoyed watching this. Be sure to check out Rick Swords Watercolor Friends and Subscribers on Facebook if you haven't. And if you have questions about my materials, you can always go to the studio page on my website, rsurwitzart.com. If you have specific questions, you can email me at contact@rsurwitzart@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.